Dr. Borja. I'd just like to say special thanks to Morris Robinson and the Biscayne Life Enhancement Forum for providing us this opportunity. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Melissa White with the Biscayne Foundation, and we're happy to be able to provide these lectures on healthy eating, healthy living, healthy aging, so that we can provide a healthy community. Without further ado, Nick Borja, let me tell you a little bit how I met Nick. I was having lunch with his wife, his beautiful wife, Annie Lauren, and we were talking about Annie runs Miami Homes for All, affordable housing, and she just happened to mention her husband and what he does, and I said, oh, tell me more. And then Marius and I got to sit down with Nick, and we learned about what he does and why he does it, and we thought that all of you needed to hear the story so that hopefully we can not just cure cancer, but prevent cancer. So without further ado, Dr. Nick Borja.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Nick Borja. So I've got a pretty simple message for you today, and that is essentially that there is a lot we can all do to prevent and even fight cancer. And I'm going to be explaining today the most important step that we can all take, and I'll be doing that by sharing 3 cancer insights with you today, okay? So the first one is, and by the way, I'm controlling the slides with my phone, so I'm not text messaging while I'm talking. So the first insight I have for you is how the way we eat can turn on and turn off genes that drive our cancer risk. Just to give you a little sense of my background, I graduated medical school from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and then, nice, some alums, okay. And then I went to UT Southwestern in Dallas, Texas for general surgery residency. After 3 years there, I went on to do a postdoctoral fellowship in cancer genetics with a research from the NIH. And here are a couple of publications from that time doing research. And at first I was really excited to be on the front lines fighting cancer. And over time, I started to see limitations in the science I was involved in. And what I started to realize is that cancer is this massive knot. And most research labs, including my own, we get focused on teasing out and pulling on our specific tangle without really thinking about all the other interconnected tangles and knots that are other focuses of other labs doing research. And so the problem with that, and the specific problem with that approach with cancer, is that cancer is incredibly dynamic. It's always changing. And this is just a simplified illustration of the way cancer is able to change its gene expression, and as a result of changing gene expression, it's able to change its behavior. In this case, it's able to change its metabolism to use whatever fuel substrate is available for energy so that it can continue growing. And that's just an example of why it's so important that we take as comprehensive an approach as possible when we're trying to succeed in the war against cancer. And so at the time in my lab, my research was really focused on pushing forward a breakthrough that we hoped was on the cusp of arriving. And that breakthrough centered around the idea that if we could use drugs that target the specific mutations of an individual's tumor, then those drugs would be more effective and improve the survival of patients. And that concept you may have heard of is called precision medicine or personalized medicine. Any nods? Yeah, maybe. So anyhow, unfortunately, that approach hasn't been very successful. This is data from a randomized controlled trial a couple years back that shows that most patients don't even qualify for a targeted therapy. In other words, they're not candidates for a drug that really targets their specific tumor. And of the patients who do qualify for a targeted drug, only about 1/3 of patients, that top box there, actually benefit. So in total, only about 7% of patients benefit from targeted therapy to their specific tumor. And at the time, this was obviously really disappointing for me because I'd invested years of research and my own time, but more importantly, by that time, I'd already taken care of hundreds of patients who had cancer. And I felt like I was letting them down. And then I came across this paper by Dr. Walter Willett. He's the chair of public health at Harvard Medical School. And he used mathematical models that he borrowed from some really smart people at MIT. And he estimated that 32% of cancer deaths in the United States could be prevented through the way we eat. And when I read that, I was absolutely floored. I had never heard that there was any relationship between the way we eat and cancer risk. It hadn't ever been part of my training. It had never been a part of a conversation that I'd ever had with a patient. So I really needed to learn more. And so then I discovered the story of blue zones. And some of you may be familiar with blue zones. These are small populations distributed all over the world that have where the individuals living in those communities have extremely long lifespans. And they have long lifespans in part because they have very low rates of chronic diseases like cancer. And when you look at what all these populations spread across the world, what they have in common, one of the key defining features is that they have a traditional diet of unprocessed foods that are mostly plants. Now that isn't definitive proof, but then I started reading more research, and these researchers look at populations over time. And what they found, what many different groups of researchers have found, is that when populations experience very significant changes in lifestyle or their environment, their cancer risk sometimes also changes very dramatically. And one group of researchers looked and found that when Asian women come and move to the United States, their breast cancer risk increases sixfold, 600% increase risk of breast cancer by moving to the United States compared to their relatives who stayed home. So we're not talking about genetic differences here. And similarly, Africans who come to the United States have 15 times the risk of colon cancer and 8 times the risk of prostate cancer. So this was further evidence, but definitely not definitive proof. So a group of researchers from Yale several years ago conducted a study to try to determine, was nutrition really the causative variable in driving these disparities in cancer risk? And what they did is they took a group of African Americans who were eating the standard American diet, high saturated fat, low fiber, and they also got a group of Native Africans who eat a low-fat diet that's mostly plants, very high in fiber. And what they did is they switched the diets of the two groups. And after just 72 hours, they took samples of the microbiome in both groups of patients. The microbiome is the ecosystem of bacteria, viruses, protozoa that live in our large intestine. So we have tens of trillions of bacteria that live in our large intestine, and they have far-reaching effects on our entire physiology. So they affect our immune system, and this has been research that's really evolved over the past decade. They affect everything from our immune system to our metabolism and even our mood. And so what these researchers found is there were dramatic changes in the microbiome of both groups. The African Americans went from having a microbiome that was full of essentially languishing bacteria to very robust, healthy, diverse populations. And the reverse happened with the Native Africans. Their microbiome languished as the African Americans had been. And the researchers, what's really great about this study is they took it a step further. And after 2 weeks, they took tissue biopsies of both groups and they looked at it under a microscope to see how was the actual tissue of these participants changing. And what they found is in the African American group, they had marked decrease in inflammation, and their cell growth had been abnormal before the start of the study, and now they had normal cell growth. And all of this portended a much lower cancer risk. Meanwhile, the Native Africans, who normally have 15 times lower cancer risk than we do here in the United States, the Native African group had increased inflammation, abnormal cell growth, and increased cancer risk. So this was really clear evidence in a controlled trial that nutrition can drive the dramatic differences in cancer risk that we see when we look at populations over time. So now my next question is, how consistent is this effect? Because there are research studies that can prove almost anything. And so I wanted to see, is this something that is this a kind of a one-off study, or has the link between nutrition and cancer been demonstrated time after time after time? And what's really crazy is when I started searching, I found over 10 papers in a single afternoon, all published in top journals over the last few years, showing a very strong association between the way we eat and cancer risk. And it shouldn't be particularly surprising because the major cancer organizations, including the WHO, the American Cancer Society, all do emphasize the importance of a healthy diet for preventing cancer. So then, at that point, my horizons are expanding very quickly, and so I can't help but wonder, what about people, and this is obviously a small subset of cancer patients, but what about people who have very elevated cancer risk? Do those individuals also get protection by eating a healthy diet? And so I looked at a paper of BRCA gene mutation carriers who have up to an 80% risk of lifetime risk of breast cancer. And what a group of researchers found is that diverse fruit and vegetable intake decreased this group's risk of cancer by 73%. And similarly, in Lynch syndrome patients, individuals who have up to a 70% lifetime risk of colon cancer, when these individuals eat highly processed foods, their risk of colon cancer went up by over 100%. So, and the researchers of this second trial, you may have heard headlines earlier this year about the rise of colorectal cancer in millennials. The researchers posited, based on this research, that in fact it's probably highly processed food intake that's driving the increase in colorectal cancer among millennials. So this was obviously very alarming findings. And then I took it even a step further and I thought, okay, well, if we know that the way we eat can even influence individuals at high genetic risk, is it possible that the way we eat could even influence cancer once it already exists? Maybe even reverse cancer once it exists. And actually, turns out a group of researchers from the University of California, San Francisco performed a study to look at that very thing. What they did is they took a group of early stage, low risk prostate cancer patients who were opting to do a watch and wait approach. And they randomized them to two groups. The first group, the control group, was given kind of run-of-the-mill dietary and exercise information and told to stick to it as best as they could. The second group was put on a 100% plant-based, whole foods, low-fat diet. So they went for it and had them take on a pretty healthy lifestyle. And what they saw after 1 year is that the PSA of the control group went up just a little bit, 6%, but that's about what you would expect. A couple of the patients in the control group had to even drop out and get medical intervention. So it probably would have been a little bit higher. In the plant-based group, the PSA level went down. So PSA, for those of you who may not be aware, prostate-specific antigen is a marker of prostate cancer progression. So we generally assume that when that number goes up, that the prostate cancer is progressing. And what's even more remarkable is after 2 years on the plant-based diet, the individuals in the plant-based group had 6 times lower risk of needing a medical intervention like surgery, radiation, or medical castration compared to the control group. So again, that's 600% lower risk of needing an intervention. So pretty remarkable findings. And what I love about this study is that the researchers decided it's not enough that we've had these findings, we want to understand why a genetic disease like cancer can be influenced by nutrition. What they did is, this is a heat map of gene expression. And what we see up here in this top, where it's green, is these are cancer promoting genes, okay? And these are cancer promoting genes that are turned on, because they're green, at the start of the study. And then what we see to the right is that those cancer-promoting genes get turned off. And similarly, right over here, these are cancer-suppressing genes. 3 months into the study, in the plant-based diet group, those cancer-suppressing genes get turned on. So this is clear evidence that the way we eat directly affects our genes, even in tissue that has progressed and become neoplastic or cancerous. So that's insight number 1. Now we're going to move on to insight number 2, how the foods we eat can enhance or undermine our body's natural defenses against cancer. Okay? So, now it was pretty clear to me that nutrition and cancer were related, but I still didn't know why plants were so healthy. And the first connection that I made was that a lot of extraordinarily powerful compounds do come from plants and are used in modern medicine. In fact, many of our commonly used chemotherapies today come from plants. So that, however, doesn't necessarily mean that the foods we're actually eating contain these powerful compounds. So that's why I started looking into, do the foods we eat actually have these powerful compounds as well? And what I found is that, yes, in fact, they do. There's thousands of powerful compounds in the foods that we eat. And they have a fancy name. They're called phytochemicals. And you may not have heard that term, but you actually all know what phytochemicals are, because oftentimes they're referred to as antioxidants. And the reason antioxidants isn't the right term for phytochemicals is because phytochemicals, they have antioxidant effects, but they actually do a lot more than just act to quench reactive oxygen species. So other things they do include regulate hormone metabolism, enhance detoxification of environmental contaminants. They modulate cell proliferation, so make sure the cells are dividing when they should be and not dividing when we don't want them to be. They tamp down inflammation. They enhance immune function. So they have a bunch of different roles in our body. And again, you may have heard of these. People oftentimes talk about the antioxidants in red wine, resveratrol, or the antioxidants in turmeric, that's curcumin, or quercetin, which is found in a bunch of different foods, but particularly abundant in lemon. So this is just a gross oversimplification of all the different families of phytochemicals, but I just want to emphasize how ubiquitous they are in the foods we eat. There's a family called the carotenoids, which I'm sure you've heard of. They're pigment compounds that include beta-carotene and lutein, as well as lycopene, and these are really abundant in leafy green vegetables. Then there's organosulfur compounds that are found in garlic and onion and cruciferous vegetables like kale and broccoli. And then there are lignans, which we typically find in whole grains as well as seeds. And so the next question I ask myself is, well, I wonder if we could take these phytochemicals, isolate them, give them to patients in high doses, and maybe they'd have a strong anti-cancer effect. And it turns out, unfortunately, that the research shows that there are no phytochemicals that we know of, at least at this point, that have a long-term benefit in protecting against cancer. And the story is actually really similar to the story of most nutritional supplements that have been investigated for their protective effect against cancer. This right here is a study that was done recently where the researchers brought together 70 different cancer prevention trials that were done using nutritional supplements of different sorts, vitamin C, beta-carotene, magnesium, zinc. And what the researchers found is there was no evidence of a cancer protective effect with these nutritional supplements where they were administered in high doses in isolation. And so the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force and both the Institute of Medicine, because of this evidence, recommend against nutritional supplementation for the purposes of cancer prevention in an otherwise healthy individual. And so the question I ask myself is, well, what's different about supplements compared to food? why do individuals recommend that we eat, or why do these health organizations recommend we get the nutrients from food rather than supplements? And it turns out this is one of the areas where science is still catching up to the complexity of nature. But we know that foods, and this is our lovely Florida orange, foods have nutrients that complement one another and appear to magnify one another's effect. So the benefits that you get from a nutrient in isolation can't really compare to the benefits that they offer when they're together and offering synergistic benefits. So for instance, the Florida orange has micronutrients like vitamin C, folate, potassium. It also has a diversity of fibers. And remember from that study of the native Africans and African Americans, fiber is really important for feeding our microbiome and getting robust populations there. It's also important for our own personal digestion and metabolism. And then there are different classes of phytochemicals. There are the flavonoids, the limonoids, and carotenoids. And all of these classes of phytochemicals have slightly different specialties. Some are particularly favorable for aiding with DNA repair. Others are particularly effective as antioxidants. So again, this illustrates how food adds up to more than the sum of its individual parts. And meanwhile, I was wondering about animal products because in the research I kept finding that animal products increase the risk of high intake of animal products, increase the risk of cancer incidence and cancer mortality. And I didn't really understand why. On one hand, animal products don't have fiber and phytochemicals, but were there any substances in animal products that were particularly injurious? And it turns out that there are. Animal protein feeds the release of IGF-1, which stimulates cancer growth and has been associated with increased risk of prostate cancer. Animal protein is also full of saturated fat, which is pro-inflammatory and leads to the release of both cortisol and endotoxemia, which has been associated with lung cancer risk. There's also the risk associated with heme iron, choline, and carnitine, which are nutrients that get metabolized by our own cells into toxic byproducts that pose some cancer risk, it appears, to both our esophagus and stomach. And then finally, there are meat mutagens like heterocyclic amines, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are associated with cooking meat at of elevated temperature. And these have also been associated with pancreatic cancer and liver cancer. So I know it's a little bit of a downer. So I'm just, I know. I'm not the most popular person right now. I think that this study here will kind of clarify the approach that is most evidence-based. What a group of researchers from the National Cancer Institute published last year is they did a study where they looked at the individual food groups and they tried to measure the cancer risk that was associated with each individual food group. And what they found is that each food group either caused a modest increase in risk or a modest decrease in risk of cancer. They were looking at cancer mortality specifically in this study. But what's interesting is that when they added the cumulative risk of all the food groups together and looked at a mostly plant-based diet and compared that to a more animal product-based diet, they found that the risk of cancer death decreased by 65% for a mostly plant-based diet. So to me, that highlights the way we need to be thinking about food, which is as a pattern of eating, as a total diet, rather than expecting that a specific nutrient or supplement or even food, single food, is going to solve or negate our cancer risk. So that is insight number 2. And moving on to insight number 3, how to lower our cancer risk even further by losing weight and keeping it off for good, without counting calories or spending our life in the gym. So this is a picture of me and my wife several years ago, and as you can see, I'm a little bit chubbier. While I'm going through all of this exploration, I have to admit I wasn't actually a model of health. I was probably about 20 pounds heavier than I am now, and I couldn't run anymore. If I went running for maybe a mile, my knees would have excruciating pain. So I definitely, on one hand, I definitely knew that I wanted to decrease my cancer risk and eat more plant-based, but I didn't know if that would actually help me lose the weight that I wanted to lose. And I came across studies like this one that show a direct relationship between excess body weight and cancer risk. Now, it's important to know that the cancer risk really increases when you get to the BMIs that are higher, up, above 30, and then really more BMI above 35. In the 25 to 30 range, the cancer risk is actually quite low. And that's why when I talk about the most important thing you can do, it's actually really your diet rather than excess weight. But this is still an important driver of cancer risk, and I knew that it was important for me to address this head on. I still didn't know, would a plant-based diet help me lose weight in the short term? And so I found studies like the ones I have here that show that a plant-based diet isn't just good for losing weight, but it's great for keeping weight off over the long term. And the research that I'm showing here are 2 different trials where participants were put on a mostly plant-based diet, and they were followed, they lost weight, everything was finished, and then the researchers called them back at 6 months, at a year, at 2 years, and weighed them to see were they continuing to lose weight or had they gained the weight back. And what they found is the participants had continued losing weight, they had stuck to the diet, and they had found it a really helpful way of keeping the weight off. And that's a really important finding because most calorie restriction diets look more like this red line here, where individuals lose weight at first and then the weight comes back. So that was another piece of information that made me think, okay, maybe this is really worth giving it a try. And so I actually ended up finding it quite simple to adhere to a mostly plant-based diet. And the thing I found is that what was great about eating more plant-based is that I was able to eat as much as I wanted without worrying about not getting full. And I didn't have to count calories because plant-based foods are generally very voluminous. Are generally very voluminous, as you can see from the fruits and vegetables, the grains and legumes. And that activates our stretch receptors and tells our brain, hey, you don't need to eat anymore, you're full. So that's a really helpful mechanism to be using in order to control the cravings and wanting to eat as much as possible. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, fat and oil is very energy dense, so it's easy to have a little bit and not realize how many calories you're consuming. So that was a pleasant surprise. The other pleasant surprise for me was that I had more energy. All of a sudden, the sluggishness that I had kind of taken for granted had evaporated, and I was eager to be exercising more. So the challenge, I think, is that the challenge that I think we all shared, I certainly felt this, was that there's social pressure, obviously, but even more than that, we live in a food environment right now that makes it very difficult to swim upstream and eat healthy. We're generally surrounded by pizza, chips, donuts, ice cream, and that means that we're constantly being tempted. And so I think that it's an apt analogy is in the 1830s, Americans drank 4 times as much alcohol as they do today. They would drink it for breakfast very commonly. And then in the 1960s, no one here probably remembers this, but the Americans smoked a lot of cigarettes. Restaurants, work, airplanes were full of cigarette smoke. So, so now today in the 21st century, I think food is really our challenge. And this is just a report put out by the CDC, and what they show is that when you enter adulthood in the United States, whether you're overweight or normal weight, you gain weight at about a clip of a little over a pound a year throughout adulthood. And it appears to be a consistent effect for most Americans. And that just further underlines the kind of challenge we have. We dig ourselves into a hole that's hard to get out of. The good news is that when you make choices that are aligned with preventing cancer in the long term, you're also helping yourself get fit and feel more energized. So that concludes insight number 3, how to lower our cancer risk even further by losing weight and keeping it off for good. So I just wanted to show you this. This is me a year after, yeah, showing off. This is me a year after eating a plant-based diet, and I was doing my first ultra marathon. And the reason I'm sharing that with you is because I've really learned personally that health is the foundation for all of us to live our best life. I hope that today this gets you dreaming a little bit bigger about what's possible for all of you, and let me know if there's any way I can help. So that's it. Oh, great question. Okay, so the first question, and I deliberately kept the talk. Hopefully you didn't feel like I went on too long. I tried to keep it brief so that we'd have plenty of time for questions and answers. So if people are ready to get up and leave, if anyone has questions afterwards, feel free to ask them. I just wanted to share this with you also. I started a newsletter that I publish every Sunday. If you want to text me your email address to my secure line, I'll enter your name in, and you'll just receive this newsletter where I give updates every week on the latest health, cancer, nutrition headline, and offer a little bit of insight. So if you're interested in joining that, I also post the events that I'm starting. I'm going to be starting up a walk with a dog soon and that kind of stuff. So if you want to stay abreast of what I'm doing in the community, that's a great place to connect. So wanted y'all to know about that. So the first question I got is about organic. How important is it to eat organic? It's a great question. And the standard line that you'll generally get if you ask someone from the government is that it's much more important to eat fruits and vegetables, whether they be organic or non-organic, than just eating organic. But if you have a choice, whether they are organic or non-organic, then choose organic. I generally agree with that, though we're increasingly seeing that our environment is being polluted in all kinds of ways, and we generally find out about it 2 decades after the fact. A lot of those recommendations are based on studies that came out earlier this decade. There was a study published in France earlier this year that shows a 30% decrease in cancer risk from eating organic. Again, that was based in France. And it hasn't been replicated consistently. One of the reasons that I'm really passionate about everything I talk to you about is because it's been replicated over and over across populations, across time. So I think I generally agree. If organic is something that you can afford and you can do easily, then I would definitely recommend it. If organic is a little too expensive and you might cut your vegetable or fruit intake on the basis of eating organic, then just eat the fruits and vegetables and try to buy local. Go to the farmer's market. Oftentimes has great prices. So okay, yeah.
Hi, great talk. I wanted to ask. We've heard at other times people say that because that the fruits and vegetables and everything else nowadays, that the soil doesn't have the same nutrition as it used to have, and so that maybe you don't get all the nutrients and stuff as it used to be. Is there any truth to that? And
yes.
Is that any reason to do the supplements?
That's a really good question. One of the reasons to eat organic is because the use of fertilizers in conventional growing methods is so ubiquitous that yet trace minerals tend to be lower in conventionally farmed foods compared to organic foods. So that is another reason, aside from just the pesticides. But your question, did everyone hear her question? Yeah, okay, yeah, everyone can hear. Okay, so your question was more specifically about supplementation because of soil quality, and there is some truth to the soil quality, and to some degree it relates to the way our atmosphere is changing. So the higher presence of CO2 means that carbohydrates are being fixed more readily, and you may know this, protein requires nitrogen, and so when the air's proportion of carbon dioxide to nitrogen changes, the amount of protein that gets fixed in plants changes. And then there's also, I know, but all of this is a little minutia. The real truth is food hasn't meaningfully changed. These are things on the margin, and fruits and vegetables are still exceedingly healthy. And like I showed you with the BRCA gene mutation slide, diversity of fruit and vegetable intake is really important for, and eating whole foods is a really important component to making sure you're getting all the foods we need. A study was just published last week showing that supplementing with B6 and B12, which a lot of, especially for elderly people who may not absorb B12 that readily, B12 supplementation is really recommended. But a study just found that in postmenopausal women, fracture risk is increasing with B6 and B12 supplementation. So, yeah, so and I know, I'm not trying to scare anyone. My point is that the supplementation game is really one of ping pong. I know, it's like revolt. It's like off with his head. Yeah. So I'm not trying to say to not supplement, but I just think that I think that our general attitude in the United States, and I'm more guilty of this probably than anyone else in this room, is like, if a little is good, then more is better. And we're finding that for many different reasons, that isn't necessarily true. And so I think a conservative approach of thinking about getting your nutrition from real foods is the most proven strategy, both in terms of evidence and historically as human beings. So that's what I would recommend.
All right. Thank you.
She had I'm sorry, I'm going to get to you. She had a question.
So I want to understand exactly what is a plant-based diet. Is it no meat, no
Oh.
dairy? Is it 5 to 9 fruits and vegetables and like whatever else?
That's a great question. I was purposely ambiguous,
Okay.
and the reason why, sneaky. And the reason I was ambiguous is because it depends on the study. So oftentimes when the researchers talk about a plant-based diet, they're talking about somewhere around 70 to 80% of your diet being plant-based. So I think that a good place to start is 2 meals being exclusively plants. So 1 meal a day having, animal products. And you can space that out, so like let's say you're having some dairy at this time and meat at this time, but generally speaking, if we're talking about what a mostly plant-based diet means in terms of the research, that's what it means, somewhere around 70 to 80%, 80% plants. Now, the prostate cancer study that I showed you, I emphasized that one as being one that represented a 100% low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet. That was a departure from what most researchers studied, but the effects that you saw were also more extreme. There are other studies that I chose not to show today. For instance, a breast cancer study that was done where they just asked the women to eat 2 servings more of fruit every day. And as you can imagine, the effects from that were relatively modest. You could measure an increase in vitamin C in their bloodstream, and they did have, I think it was around 18% lower risk of breast cancer. It had a measurable effect, but much more modest than other interventions. So today I tried to stick to the studies that were looking at larger interventions, just to give you a sense of what could be possible. So, okay, this gentleman here.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Difficult treat
Yes.
cancer.
Yes,
I am
absolutely.
85 years old, and I'd like to know if you got something for Alzheimer's.
Yes. Okay. So his question was about Alzheimer's disease, and he's wondering what what can we do about Alzheimer's disease? It's as intractable, incurable disease as cancer, and so he'd like to know more about what a plant-based diet can do. Plant-based diets in general, we're learning more and more, are very effective for cognitive decline. So cognitive decline is actually a group of diseases. Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia, but the second most common form of dementia is vascular dementia. And that is also caused by the same narrowing of arteries due to the buildup of plaque that happens in coronary artery disease, for instance. And so, whereas the cause of Alzheimer's disease is a little different, it's more inflammatory, but all chronic diseases are related. Something that's anyone here in the medical field knows that it's very easy once you know what drugs people are on to predict what other drugs they're on, because chronic disease, it's connected. And so we know that actually, I have a slide that didn't make it onto this, but let me see if I can find it for you, of some research on cognitive decline, because I would like to show you that. This is a study done by Rush in Chicago. They're the leading group on cognitive decline and dietary interventions. So if you want to look up any studies, they're really the premier group. And what they found is that when you look at the reduction in rate of Alzheimer's disease across U.S. Individuals living in the United States, the standard American diet is, they made as their baseline. And when you look at a mostly plant-based diet, which is the big green dot over there, you have a reduction of risk in the 50s. So it's very powerful for prevention, is your answer. Yes, ma'am?
Do you recommend it also for children?
Yes, but children, you have to be much more careful because they're growing and we don't have much research. No one likes doing nutritional research on children for obvious reasons. As conservative as we all are with health in adults, the research community, I've done a lot of clinical research in addition to my basic science research for the NIH, and it's very difficult to get approval for any research protocol with kids. And so we don't have good evidence-based guidelines on kids' nutrition. So I can't really speak from a position as someone who's read the research because we don't have any. One thing that I will say is that we observe changes in the physiology of kids who are very young. For instance, children as young as 3 years old will have fatty streaks on their aortas. They have calcifications. Obviously in the United States we've got a problem with childhood obesity, but even in kids who are completely normal weight and otherwise look fine, the beginnings of atherosclerosis, which is the #1 killer in America, is already present. So I think that there's very good reasons to, I have 2 kids, they're 5 and 3, and it's a challenge. My kids aren't plant-based entirely by any stretch, but we're always trying to figure out new ways to get them, especially green smoothies has been really effective for us. So anyway, sorry I can't offer more on that.
Okay, that's good. How about alcohol?
Ooh. Okay, so actually alcohol gets poo-pooed a lot, and I think alcohol fits into the category of things that is going to like coffee, that is constantly going to flip-flop, and the research is quite equivocal. So I don't take, unless you're talking about alcohol intake getting above 2 to 3 glasses a night. Once you start getting to heavier amounts, alcohol is added sugar. And we know very clearly, the American Heart Association has done really good studies on the effect of added sugar. And there's a dose-response curve, which means, and this is kind of the hallmark of a very clear, identifiable effect. When you start seeing that every little bit more of added sugar you increase in your diet, you have increasing risk of chronic disease. So alcohol isn't great. but it's not horrible either. Like I mentioned, there are phytochemicals in beer also and wine. So it's I don't and that's also true for green tea, for coffee. So I think in moderation, that is. Unless the alcohol is leading to other unhealthy habits, unless it's like, oh, I'm drinking and now I have like my big chocolate bar that goes with it and my muffins, then obviously it's a pattern that maybe needs to be broken. But alcohol on its own in moderation, I don't think needs to be the main emphasis. So.
Grains.
Yes, whole grains are involved in a plant-based diet. Yeah, whole grains are very important. In fact, the WHO listed whole grain consumption as the #1 most important dietary change for the population as a whole in order to decrease cancer worldwide. Now, that's not a problem for the United States as much, but whole grain consumption is actually an important part of nutrition.
Plant-based diet versus meat?
Well, it depends on, there's a lot of flavors of a plant-based diet, and so it depends. I think cheese in moderation is certainly, there are specific problems with cheese specifically because it is so dense with fat. And there are casomorphins. I don't know if you've ever heard of these, but these are compounds present in cheese that bind to our opioid receptors in our brain. In fact, if you give, have you ever heard of naloxone? It's the drug that we give individuals who abuse opioids so that they, who overdose so that they come down. So when you give someone who's about to eat cheese naloxone, the amount of cheese they consume goes down by 1/3. So it's definitely driven to some degree by our cravings for it. I think that if you goat cheese, non-dairy cheese is going to be a little bit better, but even that doesn't have a whole lot of research behind it. I think at that point you're splitting hairs. But again, this isn't about, this, for some people, in my experience, they do really well going whole hog, jumping in. And then for other people, it's a gradual progression. And for me, the process was actually, I dove in the deep end. I tend to be fairly extreme, especially because I was spending every day researching this. So you can imagine, take this lecture and then, So it was particularly salient to me. But for other people, and this was my experience with like flossing, for instance, it took me like 3 years of trying to floss every night to actually stick to the habit where every night I floss. So everyone has a different journey. Yes, ma'am?
Breast cancer at the time, when I was 50 years old. The most important, sir, you mentioned.
You're right.
You have to wash them with special water. If you put that dirty water on your veg, you will have cancer. The water is the one you can get. I know, I can tell you that much. I know it.
Thank you for bringing that up. So her comment, for anyone who didn't hear, is the importance of water, both for, especially for washing vegetables. And that is important. Unfortunately, with food, pesticides aren't completely, they can't be removed exclusively with water. They don't only stay on the outside of vegetables, they do penetrate and that's also true for fruit. But water quality is really important, and that's something else to think about. Fortunately for now, our water quality is pretty good here in my.
Quinoa. What do you think about quinoa?
Oh, quinoa's great. Quinoa's great, but in my mind, Asian populations have had very low incidences of cancer, and they eat white rice. So I don't have, since I'm eating a mostly plant-based diet, I think that if you're eating a mostly plant-based diet, you're doing pretty good, and you don't necessarily have to worry about every meal having quinoa in it. So you can mix it up and not necessarily feel bad about that. But quinoa is a great food, especially because you're getting a little more protein than you otherwise would in a grain, and it's got great minerals too. So good for you. Yes, ma'am.
How much protein
Oh, good question.
do you need on a plant-based?
You need the same amount of protein you would otherwise need. I can pull up a slide for that. because that is a common question. The American diet, especially men, we eat twice as much protein as is recommended by the USDA. So these represent our actual protein requirements, and these are studies based on controlled chambers where we look at how much nitrogen is taken in through food and how much is excreted through our urine. And so you can see that the amount of protein we need is actually fairly modest. Now, that changes if you're an Olympic athlete. So there are a lot of plant-based athletes out there. You know, Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, Carl Lewis was plant-based when he won the Olympics. So there are plant-based athletes out there, and they may use plant-based supplements like protein powders and so forth. But that usually, if you're eating a well-balanced diet, protein isn't necessarily isn't an issue for most people on a plant-based diet. But we're all different, and I respect that, and everyone has different needs. And you know, this is a part of growth in anything is accepting that there's going to be a little bit of experimentation, and you've got to kind of approach it with an open mind. And I would never tell someone that there's only one right way to do it, of course. So you know, some people choose to supplement with protein powder, some people choose not to. So, but based on the evidence, it usually isn't necessary. You had a question too. Yeah.
So what do you suggest if there's a high protein, plant-based way of getting enough protein?
Okay, well, greens and beans, so legumes are very high in protein, and that's what I find to be very satisfying as well. It does take a while to get used to. Legumes are very rich in fiber as well. So they are very helpful for the gut microbiome, and you know that has a whole host of benefits, as I mentioned earlier. So, but greens as well, and that's another reason I think smoothies can be so great. Obviously, they're not quite as satisfying as eating the thing, but for those of us who are busy, getting a ton of kale or arugula or spinach or whatever you're putting in there, plus some nice fruit to liven it up, makes for a quick, fast, and easy way of getting lots of protein. So. Yes, ma'am.
How do we find you?
Oh, great.
After tonight.
Yes.
You are so energetic, and I want to bring my husband to you.
Yeah, that's actually the common thing. It's like, I don't think I need you, but I know someone who does. Yeah. Throw me on top of your significant other. I'm like your punishment when he's really badly behaved. If anyone is interested in working with me, or just wants to find out a little bit more about how I could potentially help them, you can send me a text to the same number that I had up there. Just send me a text, and I'll get in touch with you, and we'll chat, and we'll see. So, yes, ma'am?
Quick question. In regards to does that include, fish, seafood, chicken, red meat?
Not all animal products are created equal. Yeah, so I'd say probably if you had to grade them, obviously fish and eggs are probably going to be the healthiest sources of animal intake. So that's the best. Yeah. Let me pull something up for you that I've got a slide for that. The Seventh-day Adventists, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, they're one of the populations that's a blue zone. The only population in the United States that's a blue zone. And so they're a religious community that has really strong beliefs around health and nutrition. And so they actually present a really great opportunity for research because they all have slightly different diets, all the way from vegan or plant-based, all the way to omnivore. And so when researchers look at the nutritional adequacy of the different diets among the Seventh-day Adventists, they found the overall healthiest eating index score being the plant-based diet. And then when you look at percent at normal weight in that population, again, the plant-based diet is the healthiest. That being said, I think that we're all making compromises. We're all on a journey. I was vegetarian before I was plant-based, and we're all trying to figure it out. So I think that if you can jump from here to here, that's great. If you can jump from there to there, if you can, whatever you can do, I think you're helping yourself, and you're a role model to others, and then you're going to start seeing some improvements, and then you're going to want to do more. So I think it's all great. Yes, sir?
Plant-based diet. Your take on that as far as cancer prevention?
Well, there are no studies right now in human beings that show a cancer benefit with a ketogenic diet. Prevention. There are no studies. What we do have is we have a lot of rodent studies, and I've done a lot of rodent studies. I've cured cancer many times, by the way, guys. But I've done it in cells and in rodents. It's a very different thing to bring it up to humans. And so right now, the hype behind the ketogenic diet far exceeds what it's shown. Now, that being said, if the ketogenic diet cures cancer, I'm going to be the first one saying, everyone get on the ketogenic diet. And you guys are going to say, well, you were a plant-based diet. Well, if the research says that the ketogenic diet is healthy, then I'll be the first. But it has a far, far hill to climb, because we've been doing research on low-carb diets for decades. The Atkins diet originally started out in the 50s as a keto diet. And so it's not, even though it's been branded in a new way, it's been around for a while, and researchers have had a lot of opportunities to research it. And I have a study here that shows that low-carb diets increase the risk of cancer by 31%. And that was done in 2015 by a group out of Japan. And so I think that the ketogenic diet, it's clear that it's helpful for weight loss and short-term gains in, particularly with insulin resistance. But over the long term, I have a really hard time squaring how it could help prevent cancer and other chronic diseases over time. But that's where the evidence is right now. That could always change. So I think it's important to be humble about what we do know and what we don't know. But again, that's the evidence as it currently exists.
I'm curious to know on your Blue Zone map, which country in Central America was on there?
It's called Nicoy. It's in Honduras, or no, Costa Rica. Costa Rica, tienes razón, Costa Rica. Yeah, and you guys might know more than me. Do you know anything else about Nicoy? No? Okay. Yeah, so it's
Nicoya Peninsula.
Nicoya Peninsula, that's right. Yeah, so it's I don't really know much else other than that, and that they live a long time, to be honest. But these, they. Yeah. Oh, good question. Great.
So it's better to eat that or have the extract, and also what.
Okay. So her question was, let me make sure I got this right. Her question is, when you're eating fats, what fat is ideal to eat, and what extracts should you eat if you're going to take extracts? Is that? Okay. So, right. So the first question, that's actually a really complicated question, because there are some oils that are better for cooking. There's other oils that are better for room temperature. But in general, I really recommend trying to lower the amount of oils you use in your cooking, because oils are a tremendous source of calories. And you can cook with broth. I know it's not as flavorful, but you can get used to it in the same way lowering salt intake. You adapt. You can, instead of using full-fat coconut milk, light coconut milk, that kind of thing. And it really makes a difference in terms of lowering your calorie intake. A lot of these studies, they get really impressive effects. I didn't talk about other chronic diseases like diabetes reversal, hypertension reversal, but it's been achieved many times in a lot of different studies, but usually it's not just a plant-based diet, but a low-fat diet. Like I mentioned, fat is inflammatory. and I'm not saying no fat. I'm just saying we really need to moderate the fat. Part of the problem. Do you guys remember when everyone went after McDonald's and the super size me craze, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, McDonald's is super unhealthy, but no one talked about the fact that 1/5 of American meals was pizza. And so we're at the risk right now of demonizing added sugar so much that we're losing sight of the fact that added oils is also incredibly injurious to our health. So keep that in mind. I know it's another downer kind of comment, but if you can find ways of decreasing your oil intake, that is ideal.
In regards to the fats, what about nuts?
Nuts are definitely nuts, nut butter, that kind of stuff. When it's
even like cashews or almonds.
Those are very, very good. Great questions. When they did all the Mediterranean diet studies earlier this decade, they tried to get at that very question, and they found that nuts are very healthy. One thing to keep in mind, by the way, from the Mediterranean diet studies is a study that they don't talk about very much is they did an offshoot of the Mediterranean diet where they looked at everyone's eating scores, and they looked and saw that the more vegetarian you were on a Mediterranean diet, the lower your cardiac risk. And that actually ended up being much more significant in terms of their findings than the Mediterranean diet itself. So when they looked at extra virgin olive oil and nut consumption, they found that both were healthy to eat. Mediterranean diet generally isn't cooking with extra virgin olive oil. Usually it's consumed at room temperature, the way that study was conducted. But nuts are generally very healthy. They're very high in minerals, so it's a good complement to the plant-based diet. So especially if in moderation, because again, especially if you're concerned about weight loss. Not that you need to be, but I'm just saying for individuals who are. Oh God, I just made it worse. So coconut oil is no bueno. No bueno. Saturated fat.
Again, getting back to medium chain triglycerides.
The medium chain triglycerides, that was one study. I know what study you're talking about because there was just one. And it wasn't done with coconut oil. They were done with much shorter chain triglycerides. Coconut oil is like 12 carbons, and the MCTs were 8 carbons. So it really is apples to oranges, and just kind of a one-off study. We know the health effects of saturated fat. And in fact, when the beef industry wants to show that a plant-based diet may not be as unhealthy, the beef industry wants to show that beef may not be so bad and that a plant-based diet might not be so good. What they did is they took a tofu burger and they slathered it with coconut oil to show that a hamburger and a tofu burger led to equivalent increases in cholesterol. So if coconut oil is the thing that's being used to turn tofu into beef, I think that gives you an idea of what its nutritional quality is. So.
What about coconut water?
Coconut water I love. I mean, I have a coconut thing, and when I go running, I pick up coconuts. So sometimes you may see me holding 4 coconuts as I'm running home. I mean, I love it. I think it's perfectly great. So.
The relationship between the plant-based diet and osteoporosis.
Ooh, good question. That's a very good question. Okay, so her question was about plant-based diets and osteoporosis. So this is an area of research that is still, there's a theoretical risk, and this happened with the whole soy controversy several years ago, where there was a study in rats showing that soy may cause cancer, but everyone in China and Japan who consumes soy has much lower risk of breast cancer. So we had a lot of trouble knowing what to recommend. Do we recommend soy? Do we say stay away from soy? And eventually they did the studies, and consuming a good amount of soy's full of phytochemicals. It's incredibly helpful in decreasing breast cancer risk, so it's perfectly safe. But similarly, with osteoporosis, there's a theoretical risk that because you're not drinking high amounts of calcium, that could lead to osteoporosis. That's that's a concern. We know that bone mineralization is much more complex than just calcium. It's obviously vitamin D and protein intake, vitamin C. So there's a lot of different components. And what we do know is that in long-term studies in the Seventh-day Adventists, so these are the best proxies we have for elderly people who have been on a plant-based diet for a while, because this is a group that is populous enough that has been doing the plant-based thing for a while. In these groups, there's no increased incidence of osteoporosis. The finding that has been consistent is that bone mineralization does not change on a whole food plant-based diet. Now, there are studies from Europe a couple decades back where some fairly unhealthy vegans were found to have, and when I say unhealthy vegans, you can look in these studies at what their macronutrient content was, and their fiber levels were really low, and their like blood plasma levels of different vitamins and minerals was really low. So you could tell that they probably weren't eating a whole food plant-based diet. They're probably eating like a lot of the fake meats and that kind of stuff. So in that population, they found that there was a slightly increased risk of vertebral fractures. And so that's the one study that has made people a little nervous about osteoporosis. So we only have a smattering of studies to draw from. I wish we had something more conclusive for you, but that's where we're at right now.
A good question. Will I lose muscle if I
Oh.
eat plant-based?
Oh, okay, so her question was, will I lose muscle if I'm plant-based? I talked about the protein requirement earlier. This study was a trial done where they tried to answer that question exactly. So what they did is they had people exercising, and then they had individuals on a plant-based diet exercising. And what they found is that the plant-based diet plus the exercise accelerated the weight loss, and simultaneously the individuals on the plant-based diet gained a greater amount of muscle mass. And it was partly a function, as you can see, the fat loss was so high that proportionally their muscle mass increased. It wasn't just the exercise that led to such a disparity in muscle gain, but it certainly appears to be the case. And we have so many famous athletes who use, even LeBron James for quite a while has gone plant-based in and out. So there's a lot of evidence that you can do it. I'm not, I've run ultra marathons, so in endurance sports, it's much more common. And for me, I wouldn't have been able to ever run that distance if I hadn't changed my diet. So, but that's anecdotal evidence. So I'm not, but. There are instances like pregnant women where you need to be taking supplementation. So I want to be really careful to distinguish circumstances where your medical provider deems it responsible for you to be taking supplements. I think that's perfectly appropriate. But multi-mineral vitamin supplementation, the research is very black and white on that. The answer is no. The research is very clear. That being the case, I'm not going to say if you take a supplement and you find that it's helping you, and you did your research and you think that it's helping you, great. I mean, my goal is for you to be happy and healthy. So that's great. But I think that it's easy to get distracted with a lot of marginal stuff instead of focusing on the one thing that's going to actually make a difference. So I encourage you to think about your diet, because I can guarantee you it will influence your risk of all the chronic diseases that you don't want to get. And we have very clear evidence that it's effective. That's why we do science, to know what we can generalize to the population at large.
Give lectures to doctors because they know so little about nutrition.
I'd like to. Her question was about physicians and how do you. It's a good question. It's a delicate one. So I'm thinking about it. If you have any great ideas, please let me know. So I know we're pressed for time, or I think we've been here for a while, so I'll let you guys go. Oh, and thank you.
for coming.
Thank you.
And If you do have any other questions and you didn't get his number, you can always call the foundation and we'll give you all the information. You will also be able to see the entire presentation online at the Key Biscayne Community Foundation YouTube channel. Yeah, courtesy of Terry Scott. So thank you very much.
Thank you to Key Biscayne.